was the battle that split the century in two. Hitler's greatest army, Stalin's unbreakable city. Two giants collided on the banks of the Volga, and the world held its breath. What began as a lightning strike became a frozen siege. For 200 days, Stalingrad became the center of the earth, where steel met snow, fire met flesh, and no rule of war remained. Entire divisions were swallowed by rubble. Snipers turned ruins into graves, and the Volga ran dark with the blood of 1,000 assaults. But the city did not fall. Its people fought from sewers, from stairwells, from beneath the ice. The Red Army turned the impossible into retribution. And when the smoke finally lifted, Hitler's myth of invincibility lay buried beneath the snow. Stalingrad was not just a turning point. It was a reckoning. In the summer of 1942, the German war machine shifted south. The Caucasus oil fields had become the new obsession. Hitler, driven by both strategic hunger and personal ego, pointed his armies not toward Moscow, but toward the shimmering steppes and rivers of southern Russia. The Wehrmacht advanced like it had so many times before, fast, brutal, efficient. But this time there was a fracture beneath the momentum. The victory of 1941 had not come. The winter had hurt them. And deep in his headquarters, Hitler was no longer satisfied with strategy. He wanted a symbol, a name, Stalingrad. On paper, the city was nothing more than an industrial node by the Volga. But to Hitler, it was Stalin's namesake. And that made it personal. He diverted the Sixth Army, the pride of the Wehrmacht, away from its primary objective and pointed it toward the city with a single command: take it. General Friedrich Paulus, a methodical man, followed the order without protest. His Sixth Army began to shift east, while Hitler sat in the wolf's lair redrawing maps that no longer matched reality. Stalin saw the maneuver for what it was: an insult, a threat, a dare, and he answered with steel. He issued Order Number 227, not one step back. It was not a suggestion. It was a verdict. Retreat was punishable by death. Behind every frontline unit stood a second unit, blocking detachments, often manned by NKVD agents, tasked with shooting any man who fled. The Red Army was no longer retreating. It was now ordered to die in place. The city began bracing for war. Trenches were carved into sidewalks. Barricades rose between apartment blocks. Schools turned into machine gun nests. Civilians were told to stay, not as victims, but as defenders. And then came the bombing. August 23rd, 1942. The Luftwaffe descended with fire. Hundreds of bombers blanketed the city in explosives. The Volga burned. Rail stations vanished. Hospitals collapsed. In a single afternoon, 40,000 civilians were killed. The city was left unrecognizable. Concrete splinters, twisted steel, the smell of burnt flesh. But Stalingrad did not empty. In the early hours after the bombing, a Soviet political officer named Mikhail Andropov was given his first command: enforce the order. He was 28, educated, and had never fired a rifle in combat. His unit, mostly boys from rural villages, broke under artillery fire during a German probing attack. One man, Pavel, no older than 19, turned and ran toward the rear. Mikhail aimed his pistol. He hesitated, then fired. The bullet struck Pavel in the back of the head. The next morning, Mikhail buried him alone and vomited behind a ruined bakery. He would live through the war but never speak of it again. His name would be lost in archives. But his choice, and men like him, made Stalingrad hold. As the Germans neared the outskirts of the city, they moved with mechanical confidence. Soldiers marched through sunflower fields, watching smoke on the horizon. Many believed the war was almost over. A young German radio operator named Dieter Koch scribbled a letter to his sister the night before entering the city. "Don't worry, Anna. We'll be through Stalingrad in 2 weeks. The Soviets are already breaking. The city looks small from the hill. It reminds me of Würzburg. Tell Mother I'll send photos." He never sent the letter. Weeks later, it was found folded in his jacket pocket, on a body slumped against a burned-out tram. His fingers were missing. His eyes were open. A Soviet bayonet was lodged beneath his ribs. General Vasily Chuikov arrived in the city not to defend it, but to outlast it. His 62nd Army was tattered, exhausted, and half-starved. But he understood what had to be done. Chuikov would not build defensive lines. He would build kill zones. His strategy was cruel and precise. Remove the space between enemy and defender. No man's land would become stairwells. Artillery would become useless. The Germans would be forced into close combat where Soviet familiarity with the ruins would dominate. As the first German tanks rolled into the city, Chuikov gave one final order. "Let the enemy come. Let them bleed in our streets." Stalingrad was no longer just a target. It had become a trap with no way out. By mid-September, the Germans entered Stalingrad expecting to fight a crumbling army. What they found instead was a city turned against them. From the very first step into the outskirts, something felt wrong. The streets didn't look like territory to conquer. They looked like a trap that had already been sprung. Buildings stood open like broken jaws. Smoke curled from every doorway. The Luftwaffe's bombing campaign, meant to cripple the defenders, had instead created a nightmare of debris, sniper nests, and ambush points. Each street had to be taken meter by meter. The Germans advanced through factory blocks, only to be shelled from the rear. Tanks turned corners and disappeared into clouds of dust, metal, and fire. The front line didn't move forward. It folded into itself, day after day. The Soviets fought like men who had nowhere else to go, because they didn't. They were ordered to hold or die, and most were already halfway to death. What they lacked in supplies, they made up for in grit. Entire units defended single buildings for weeks without relief. One platoon was ordered to defend the city's massive grain elevator. The structure was nearly out of food, water, and ammunition. The Germans surrounded it and assaulted from 3 directions. The Soviets set the grain on fire rather than let it fall into enemy hands. They fought for 8 days, coughing through the smoke, blind from ash, bullets snapping through walls made of concrete and flame. When the Germans finally stormed the building, they found blackened corpses still gripping their rifles. Across the city, another story unfolded in silence. A teenage Soviet nurse named Elena crawled through fire and rubble to reach the wounded trapped beneath a collapsed school. The roof had caught fire from German shelling. Screams came from the basement. She didn't hesitate. Her uniform burned at the edges. Her hair caught sparks. But she pulled 30 men out one by one through a hole no wider than her shoulders. When they found her the next morning, her hands were burned raw, her face swollen with smoke. She lived. Most of the men she saved did not, but their last breath had a witness. In the chaos, German units learned a new word: Rattenkrieg, the war of the rats. No clear fronts, no stable ground. Just stairwells soaked in blood, basements wired with explosives, rooftops occupied by snipers who vanished like ghosts. Pavlov's house became a symbol of this war. A small 4-story apartment building, defended by a Soviet squad under Sergeant Yakov Pavlov, held off the Germans for nearly 60 days. The men inside wired every floor with mines, built loopholes through the walls, and maintained a constant crossfire that turned the area around the building into a death trap. Tanks rolled past, unaware that behind every window was a rifle. When reinforcements finally reached them, the defenders were down to a few rounds each, and still had not lost the building. The Germans adapted poorly to the maze. They had trained for open field engagements, blitzkrieg, and mechanized advances. Here, a man could die 10 feet from his own commander and no one would know until hours later. Flamethrowers were used recklessly. In one tragic case, a German squad incinerated its own infantry trapped inside a structure they were trying to clear. Their screams echoed down the street for over a minute before silence returned. By night, the Volga River boiled with activity. Soviet barges, many no better than rafts, crossed under constant bombardment. They carried reinforcements, ammunition, and the wounded, what little could be moved in the darkness. Some boats sank from the weight of the dead alone. Others never even reached the shore. And all the while, from the shadows, the snipers hunted. One name began to echo among the ruins: Vasily Zaitsev, a shepherd-turned-sniper from the Urals. He became a myth and a method. Crawling through sewer grates, hiding beneath rubble, he stalked German officers for days. His rifle bore no markings. His breath, slow and measured, matched the pulse of a man who had come to see death not as victory, but as rhythm. By the end of the battle, his confirmed kills would surpass 200, but he rarely spoke of them. Only once did he whisper to a fellow soldier, "I don't aim for the man, I aim for the mistake." The German infantry grew quieter. Helmets felt thinner. Eyes scanned windows before looking at the street. Even hardened SS units began writing home about the fear. Not of artillery, not of tanks, but of silence, of the eyes they never saw. The city bled, but it did not break. And as September became October, the Germans began to realize the truth. They had entered a furnace, not a battlefield. And they were not the ones stoking the fire. The first snow arrived in October. It was not gentle. It came in sheets and howls, biting through torn uniforms, sliding into boots already soaked with blood. The frost made iron too cold to touch. Weapons jammed. Hands split open at the knuckles. Men woke up with eyelids frozen shut. Stalingrad's war did not pause. It only changed color. Inside the ruins, the line between soldier and civilian blurred. There were no safe zones. Basements became clinics, kitchens, morgues. Entire families hid beneath collapsed stairwells, eating wallpaper soaked in flour paste. Some had not seen sunlight in weeks. Infants starved in silence, their cries dried into wheezing. Mothers held on to corpses too long, unwilling to believe the stillness was final. A child named Lev, age 7, survived for 3 months beneath a grain silo with his older sister. They shared one biscuit every 4 days. She gave him more than her half. When rescuers finally found them in January, he was alive. She was not. The Soviets issued food rations by roll. Soldiers received meager bread and watery soup. Civilians received less, when there was anything to give. Some men dug into frozen horse carcasses in the streets, cutting away strips of meat and cooking them over scraps of flaming debris. Others boiled belts and leather shoes, scraping off nails to avoid choking. There were rumors of worse. In a collapsed tenement near the Red October factory, rescue workers discovered a family of 4 who had not eaten in weeks. Only 3 were alive. What they found on the stove was not food. The mother said nothing. She only stared at the wall and wept. The Germans fared no better. Ammunition ran low. Winter gear had been left behind during the summer campaign. Men wrapped themselves in curtains, tablecloths, even straw bundled beneath uniforms. Frostbite was no longer a risk. It was a sentence. Fingers turned black, then white, then fell off during the night. Medics amputated with dull knives, no anesthetic, and often on kitchen tables. The screams, one Soviet officer recalled, were worse than artillery. Some German soldiers tried to tunnel beneath collapsed buildings to stay warm. In one case, a company of 35 men died overnight when their shelter collapsed under the weight of ice and concrete. Only one man survived, frozen up to his waist, unable to move. his mouth blue with frost. Across the Volga, Soviet reinforcements continued to cross under constant fire. Most never made it. The river was open, wide, and merciless. One transport barge carried 300 men. A direct artillery strike split it in two. Bodies surfaced days later, bloated and pale. Yet, still they came. Still they crossed. Inside the city, the soundscape of war shifted. No longer dominated by shells and machine guns. Now it was the muffled crunch of snow, the shallow breaths of men trying to stay awake through sub-zero nights. Patrols moved slower. Gun barrels steamed in the cold. Corpses froze where they fell, fingers outstretched, eyes wide open. The living stepped around them without pause. There were too many to bury. In a ruined cathedral near the city center, 20 civilians huddled beneath the altar, praying quietly in the dark. A German shell tore through the ceiling. The impact didn't kill them, but the cold did. Rescuers found them days later, frozen in place, kneeling. One Soviet soldier, returning from the front line for rotation, entered what used to be a bakery. Inside, 6 civilians sat motionless around a table. A single candle burned. He called out. No one answered. All of them had died the night before, still seated, as if still waiting for bread to be made. The factories became crypts. The streets became traps. And Stalingrad, once full of voices, now whispered only with the wind. But through it all, the city did not fall. Men who could not walk still crawled to their firing posts. Women carried water up 12 flights of bombed stairs just to clean blood from a hallway. A Soviet artilleryman collapsed from hunger but still loaded one last shell before passing out. That shell killed the German officer advancing toward his position. The war had ceased to be about land. It had become a test of will, and both sides were nearing the limits of the human spirit. By November 1942, the Germans believed they had Stalingrad on the brink. Soviet resistance was thinning. The Sixth Army controlled nearly 90% of the city. Victory, they thought, was close enough to touch. But the Red Army wasn't collapsing. It was coiling. North and south of Stalingrad, Soviet forces under Generals Vatutin and Rokossovsky had been quietly massing for months. Not in city, but around it. Stalin approved the plan himself. Operation Uranus was not a counterattack. It was an encirclement. The German flanks were held not by seasoned troops, but by overstretched Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian divisions. Men with little armor, poor equipment, and even less faith in the cause. The Soviets knew this, and when they struck, they did not strike gently. November the 19th, 1942. A snowstorm swept across the steppe. Whiteout conditions blinded both sides. And then, without warning, the Soviets attacked. The northern flank collapsed within hours. Romanian units, outnumbered 5-1, fired a few shots and ran. Some were overrun before they could radio for help. German High Command dismissed the reports as exaggerated until the southern flank collapsed the next day. Columns of T-34 tanks surged through gaps in the line, crushing barbed wire, smashing field guns, dragging smoke behind them like cloaks. Infantry followed close behind, some riding tanks, others sprinting through trenches with bayonets fixed. A Romanian signal operator in the 1st Infantry Division sent one last message before his position was overrun. No command left, no officers left, no more bullets. They are all around us. Tell my wife. Then silence. Within 4 days, the jaws had closed. The Soviet pincers met at Kaluk, west of Stalingrad. The Sixth Army, over 250,000 men, was trapped. No way out, no way in. The greatest army in Hitler's arsenal was now encircled in a city it thought it had conquered. Inside the pocket, panic simmered. At first, the officers dismissed the danger. They assumed it was temporary, that Hitler would send relief, that the Luftwaffe would supply them by air. But winter had come back with a vengeance. The skies were chaos. Blizzards whipped across the Volga, grounding aircraft. Planes that did fly were hit by Soviet fighters or crippled by freezing engines. Supplies dwindled to a trickle. The Sixth Army needed 700 tons of food and ammunition per day. The Luftwaffe delivered less than 80. General Paulus, meticulous and obedient, refused to act without orders. He requested permission to break out while the line was still soft. The answer from Hitler was short. Stand fast. So they did, and the pocket began to rot from within. Across the lines, Soviet soldiers found the remains of Romanian units frozen into the earth. Whole companies curled in trenches like sleeping animals, rifles still clutched in stiff fingers. In one bunker, Soviet scouts found a letter addressed to a mother in Budapest. It was written in Hungarian, soaked in blood. The last line was legible. "We are not coming home." The Soviets didn't just surround the city, they tightened it. They built inner rings of artillery and outer rings of reserve troops, making relief impossible. Any breakout attempt would be suicide. Yet, one was planned. Field Marshal Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm in December, an armored spearhead meant to punch through from the southwest. It advanced quickly at first. Morale inside the Sixth Army spiked. Soldiers began preparing to meet their rescuers, but Manstein never reached them. His panzers stopped within 50 kilometers, outnumbered and running low on fuel. Paulus was ordered to hold. Again, no breakout, no coordination. Just wait. In the frozen gut of the city, hope turned to hunger, then to despair. A Soviet tank crew, advancing through the steppe, found the ruins of a Romanian field hospital. Inside, 14 men lay stacked beneath frost-covered blankets. The nurse who had tended to them had written their names on the walls in ash. Next to the last one, a line read, "I gave them all I had. I don't want to die in the dark." The Soviets took the building, gave the nurse a coat, and walked her away in silence. Inside Stalingrad, the Sixth Army still fought, house to house, floor to floor. But the fire was gone. Ammunition was limited to 10 rounds per man per day. Bayonets became the primary weapon. Trenches weren't dug. They were carved out of snow with bare hands. Paulus stopped leaving his headquarters. His face grew pale. He spoke in whispers. The Soviets, sensing the breakdown, began to close in. And with every step, the trap that had sprung in November grew tighter. By January 1943, the encircled Sixth Army was no longer a fighting force. It was a graveyard in slow motion. German soldiers inside Stalingrad had no winter gear, no bread, no fuel. Frostbite spread faster than gunfire. In some platoons, 1 man in 5 had lost fingers. Entire units lay huddled in bunkers, waiting to die. Wood was so scarce that men burned furniture, floorboards, even books to warm their hands for just a few minutes. But the fire never lasted, and the cold always returned. A lieutenant in the 71st Infantry Division wrapped a shoelace around his hand every morning to keep his fingers from shaking. It didn't help. One day, he looked down and saw 3 of them had turned black. He cut them off with a knife, not because it would save him, but because he couldn't bear to watch them rot. Corpses lined the trenches. Some were buried in snow, others half frozen in stairwells, their eyes open to the sky. In one captured German field hospital, Soviet medics found a surgeon who had continued to operate for 5 days without anesthesia. His hands were blistered. His scalpels were dull. He had lost 6 patients that morning alone. When asked why he kept going, he looked up and said, "Because they still crawl to me." Starvation transformed the Sixth Army into shadows. Soldiers searched for food like animals, crawling through bombed-out kitchens, peeling wallpaper for paste. They boiled leather belts into soup. Others chewed on candles, even floor dust. A unit of tank crewmen was discovered gnawing on the soles of their boots, teeth cracked from biting frozen rubber. The Luftwaffe, overburdened and battered, could do little. Their drop zones were bombed before they could unload. Crates shattered on impact or fell into Soviet hands. One cargo plane dropped a shipment of condoms and summer uniforms by mistake. The ground units didn't even laugh. General Paulus grew quieter. He refused to leave his basement command post. The maps on the wall no longer mattered. His men were dying by the hour. Deserters fled into the snow only to freeze within sight of their own positions. Executions continued, sometimes by firing squad, sometimes by commander's pistol. One officer was found dead beside a note that read, "My men deserve better than this." Inside the pocket, the German collapse was not sudden. It was slow, and it was final. The Soviets, watching from across the lines, noticed a shift. The machine gun fire grew less frequent. Patrols became bolder. Artillery stopped responding. Then, in the middle of January, a German soldier walked across no man's land with a white handkerchief. Behind him, more followed, limping, wounded, shaking. Some were barefoot. Soviet troops hesitated. Then they opened their lines. Thousands of Germans began surrendering, not as units, but as fragments. A sergeant leading 6 frostbitten men, a major with 3 cooks, a corporal carrying the ashes of his dead captain in a helmet. Some walked out holding their rifles upside down. Others crawled. In one ruined theater, a Soviet officer found a group of 30 Germans seated in what used to be the orchestra pit. They had arranged themselves in rows, arms folded across their chests, boots lined neatly beside them. They were dead, but not from combat. They had starved while sitting together. The officer later said it looked like a play waiting for the curtain to rise. Even in surrender, many Germans refused to believe the end had come. Rumors of rescue persisted, that Manstein was coming, that the Führer had a secret plan, that parachute drops were on the way. But nothing came. In one of the last messages received from inside the pocket, a radio operator broadcasted a single line, "We are alone." Then static. The Soviets continued their advance, street by street, block by block. But there was little left to fight. The Sixth Army, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, had become a mass of starved, broken men sitting in silence among the bones of their comrades. On January 31st, Paulus was captured, not in battle, but in a basement, sitting at a table, staring at nothing. He said nothing when the Soviets entered. He did not salute. He simply stood, nodded, and followed them out. His army did not resist. It could not. Because by then, the war inside Stalingrad was over. Only the consequences remained. Stalingrad did not fall. It was not saved either. It was endured. When the shooting stopped in February 1943, the city no longer resembled a place. It looked like the grave of civilization. Over 90% of the buildings were gone. Streets no longer had names. Rubble covered the ground so thick that tanks could not pass through it. Smoke still rose from buildings where no fire had been seen in days. A single clock tower still stood, its hands frozen at 12:14. No one knew if it was morning or night. In what had once been the Red October factory, Soviet soldiers found the last remnants of German resistance. 30 men, emaciated, shivering, crouched beside the burnt-out shell of a supply stove. They did not speak. When offered bread, they cried, not from gratitude, but because they couldn't remember how to chew. Out of the 250,000 Axis soldiers trapped in the encirclement, fewer than 95,000 surrendered. And of those, barely 5,000 would ever return to Germany. The rest vanished into Soviet labor camps, hunger and cold. Some were buried in mass graves. Others were simply never found. On the Soviet side, over 1 million men and women were killed, wounded, or missing. No family went untouched. Nearly every home in the city was destroyed. Yet, still, survivors emerged. From cellars, from tunnels, from beneath collapsed staircases. One woman, a teacher named Irina, had spent 138 days in a basement with 9 children. She taught them multiplication tables by candlelight. When the Red Army liberated her street, she walked them out in a line, singing a children's song about apples. Every soldier who passed them stopped marching. They stood and watched. One wept. The people who had once lived in Stalingrad were now rebuilding it with bare hands and numb fingers. Women lifted bricks that had crushed their own husbands. Children carried water in the same buckets used to extinguish fires that consumed their homes. The air smelled of ash. The ground was gray. But the city lived, not just in ruins, but in memory. Vasily Zaitsev, the sniper who had become legend, survived the war. He went blind in later years. When asked if he remembered his kills, he shook his head. "I remember the faces of those I couldn't reach in time." General Paulus, now a prisoner, would eventually testify against the Nazi regime at Nuremberg. His silence at Stalingrad had turned into reflection and regret. But most of the dead would never speak again. They remained beneath the city, in walls, in basements, in fields that still crackled with rusted metal. Bones surfaced every spring as snow melted. Shards of helmets, dog tags. Children found them while playing. Some buried them again, without knowing who they had once been. The world learned the number. Over 2 million men and women killed, wounded, or lost in a single battle. But Stalingrad was not a number. It was a threshold. It was the moment the war began to turn, not with glory, but with grief. It showed the limits of power, the price of pride, the depth of suffering that human beings could survive and inflict. And though the maps would change, though flags would fall, Stalingrad remained, not as a monument, but as a scar on history itself.